Greetings. Not every day do you get to read a book that you admire and talk with the author of that book. But this is exactly why we are here now. My name is Wissam. I work as a minister in the Detroit area, and I'm here to talk with the author of a book that I have recently read called The Reason of Reason. The book is an extremely well-written work about the existence of God using philosophy. And I am fortunate here to be with my good friend and fellow laborer in the gospel, Scott Cherry. First of all, thank you so much for enriching the Christian library and for your contribution to it. And I guess my first question would be, why this title? That sounded redundant to me in the first place. The Reason of Reason. Is the first reason different than the second reason?
Yes, it means the explanation of reason or the rationale of reason. And I use the preposition of instead of for. Some people thought you should say the reason for reason, but this is explaining almost the logic of reason, why there is such a thing as reason.
Okay, great. The book is 150 pages long, and it is by no means a quick reading. I had to read it twice. It is a very challenging book. You can agree with the argument that the author presents in his book, or you can disagree with it, but you cannot ignore the work that has been put there, which is a tremendously great work. And so my second question would be, it is a daunting task for us when we were students to write a paper for our class. So what motivated you to write a whole book? What was your motive in writing this book in the first place?
Yeah. Well, first, I didn't start off with the intent to write a whole book. I started off with the intent to write one chapter of a book about self-evident things. Things that, to me, everybody will agree are self-evident. They don't need any proof. Reason is one of those fundamental self-evident things that to me is possibly more fundamental than anything else because it doesn't need proof, in my opinion. Now, there might be people who say, yeah, reason still needs proof, but the fascinating thing is, in order to prove it, you have to use it. Reason requires reason to explain it or defend it or create a proof for it. You can do absolutely nothing intellectually without reason. Okay? So it was going to be one chapter, and then, as many things do, it just grew, it expanded. It was like a balloon. You keep blowing it and it gets bigger. And I realized, wow, I'm in over my head. There's a lot more to this subject than what I can contain in one chapter. And that's because the more I thought about it, the more I began to reflect on different applications of reason in my own mind and in my own living, but also I started paying more attention to the way other people reason. And there are examples in the book about how I reason, how my neighbors reason, how in one case my son was reasoning with me. And I became meta-conscious, always thinking about how reason works in experience, and then also reading into the philosophical works of writers who write about reason, and one of those is prominent in the book too. His name is C.S. Lewis.
Well, the reader is certainly fortunate that you had this desire to expound on what you had in mind for the first place. So when you were writing the book, I know that you are a minister, so you hang out with Christians a lot. You also live in the Detroit area, so you get exposed to, you have a lot of friends from followers of other belief systems as well. I think you are going to college where you are studying philosophy, where atheism, agnosticism, and other systems exist. Did you have any specific how should I say it, ideal reader or an audience that you wanted to target with this book?
I'm not sure if there was one ideal reader. I think I had an eclectic audience in mind, that this would appeal to people who just like to reflect and who are rational and they like to think about their rationality. People who believe in God, but who also don't believe in God, members of other religions, Muslims, Hindus or Buddhists. Really, it has a wide audience in mind. And certainly for those who are theists, they believe in God, I want to appeal to their belief in God. I want to, affirm their belief in God, since I believe in God. And I think there are strong, defensible reasons for believing in God. Mm-hmm. But I think that we don't only have to talk about faith with reference to God. We can talk about why God gave us reason. That means God likes reason, okay? And he endowed us with this capacity that animals don't have. Mm-hmm. Now, for the non-theists, I certainly want to convince them that they should re-examine the question of God. They should explore the functions of reason and logic, mm-hmm. and rationality and intelligibility, things that are in this book. And they should come back and consider, is there a God? Should I believe in God based on the way that I am endowed with reason?
Okay, very interesting. You have just shared something about your own belief system, and you said you are a Christian who believes in God. And yet in the book you said that your argument in favor of God was inductive and not deductive, meaning that you did not assume before the writing of the book that there is a God and you tried to use arguments to prove that, but rather you observed things that are naturally there for everybody to observe, and then you concluded that there is a God. And so that's what you proposed in your book. However, I think I read in page 48 that you said, regardless of your belief system, I only ask you to consider it, meaning the existence of God, with me as a thought experiment. Do you think your presupposition of the existence of God may have influenced your neutrality in writing this book and presenting it to people who may or may not share your belief system?
Well, sure. On one hand, I would love to say I'm completely non-biased, and I came at this subject with absolutely no presuppositions, but I think that's impossible. Okay. Frankly, everyone already believes something, and they have presuppositions that they're aware of or that they're not aware of, and they approach every subject through these lenses. Well, we call it a worldview. Sometimes collectively, the lenses formulate the way someone interprets the whole entire world, the whole universe, everything, just everything. And no, I did not approach this book then like a blank slate, because I don't think you can, and I wouldn't want to, because I'm proud that I believe in God. I rejoice that I can find my identity in God, and I'd love to talk a lot about God, but I don't want to go too far with your question, at least not yet. I'm not ashamed of that. I'm simply asking people to consider it in a very low pressure kind of approach.
Very good. In fact, when I read that book, I kind of got that impression. I'm just asking you this for you to share your opinion with the viewer of this video. I did realize that the book was very neutral and very professionally presented. And speaking of presentation, now I have a background in engineering, and so I'm all into math, and I kind of read that you do not like the math part of logic, because we used logic a lot in our pure mathematical studies and in engineering. Does the reader need a philosophical background to learn about God in this book or to understand what you're presenting? You have presented a lot of very rich arguments that because I don't have a background in philosophy, I could understand, but I don't know if the book was written to me, somebody with no background in philosophy.
Sure.
So what do you think of that?
Yeah, like I said, I'm trying to reach the average man, the average woman, okay, who have never taken a philosophy class ever before, and yet also appeal to, philosophy professors. I gave copies of this book to most of my philosophy professors as an example. So I didn't want it to be too low for them, and I didn't want it to be too high for the average person that even has an allergy towards philosophy. So there are lots of parts of the book that will appeal to the everyday reader if they have a little bit more of an intellectual bent. And yet there are some parts, when I get into my argument with Dr. Michael Martin, that become the most philosophical of the book in chapters 10 and 11, where I confront an atheist philosopher who is now deceased about his rejection of what's called the Transcendental Argument. So already that sounds very philosophical, the Transcendental Argument. Well, I tried to break it down and do it in as everyday language as possible. And yet in other chapters, earlier chapters, I think I appeal to people that like stories. I tell a story about a cockatiel that found its way into my backyard, for example, and how I processed the reason why there's a cockatiel in my backyard. And I tell a story about a little girl who's on the corner of my block, who I encountered one day. She was pushing a baby buggy around the corner, and she and I had a conversation about whether there was a baby in there and whether it was reasonable to expect someone to be pushing a baby buggy without a baby in it. So I think it's even kind of cute and charming, and I hope that people will also agree.
Very good. Speaking of logic, I have always thought that what makes sense to me may not necessarily be the case. For example, when we talk about gravity as a very example of logic, if you release this pen, it would fall to the ground at a velocity of 9.8 meter per second. But that is not necessarily the case if I release it on Mars, for example. And so when you talk about logic, you sounded like logic is there. It's a being by itself. And that was your argument all through the book. There is logic, and that means there is God or a God, the guy upstairs, whoever he is. Do you think that logic exists in itself and by itself? Because I've always thought that logic was a man-made language to interpret what's there. So what do you think of that?
Well, if logic is a man-made language, that is that's possible. But to interpret what is there, that's the point, that there is something there. Okay? So yes, I believe logic exists in the universe. Nobody invented logic. Nobody created logic. Even if now we use terms to describe the way that these rational laws work, then all that we've done is applied language to something real, like the laws of nature, okay? You mentioned gravity. Gravity is a law of nature. Before we had the word gravity, do you think there was gravity?
On Earth, yes, but not on other planets.
Sure, on Earth. But there was already gravity.
That's right.
We simply didn't have a word for it, or if there was a word, then people had some other word for the fact that everything falls down unless it has wings, or some other ability to create a counter force, okay, it will fall. What goes up must come down. So that's a law that eventually, for all time, people had to live in accordance with the force of gravity, whether they understood it and whether they could describe it or not. So in the same way, people have always had to live and function and relate according to the laws of logic. For example, you know how people say now, it is what it is. Okay. And it's kind of funny. It is what it is. Well, actually, that's a law of logic. Okay. It's called the law of identity. Something is what it is.
Therefore, it is and not isn't.
It is not something else. It is that. That's a law of logic. Okay. Also, most people know about the law of non-contradiction, also called the law of contradiction, which means that, and it's related to the law of identity, something cannot be not what it is at the same time and in the same place. Okay? So A cannot be non-A at the same time, same place. A tree cannot be a non-tree at the same time and in the same sense.
That makes sense.
Yes, very, very funny. There are a whole lot of laws of logic, and those are, in my book, in my understanding of reality, the laws of logic are hardwired into the universe. And so, yeah, up front, I argue that the best explanation for the laws of logic is a logical God, the God of logic, okay, that makes the law of non-contradiction function, and the law of identity, and the laws of veracity, and the laws of validity, and all kinds of other logical laws that we can identify. As an exercise, I did that in one of the chapters, I think chapter 9. I wrote out 18 of the laws of logic, but without using a textbook and without using outside sources. I wanted to pull them out of myself and put them in my own words, okay? And then I explained that reason is based on logic. Reason are the skills that we use to function in society and culture, which employ the laws of logic.
Would you hold this thought? Because that was a question of mine. In one paragraph in your book, you said that reason is a major subset of the logos, quote unquote. And then at the end of this same paragraph, you said that logic is a closely related subset of reason. So which one is a subset of which?
Well, you may have found a contradiction.
Okay.
That's possible.
Well, okay,
especially since
to be
you
fair,
have
it was
one of the
not
earlier drafts.
Right. Well, to be fair, it was not perfectly a contradiction. At the first statement said logos is reason is a subset of logos, and then you said that logic was a subset of reason. Are logos and logic the same thing, or?
Okay, I see. By the way, if you had found a contradiction, that would only demonstrate my point. There are such things as contradictions.
Okay.
And contradictions can only be real if the law of non-contradiction is real. So even that would be a fact of reason and a fact of logic. But when I talk about the logos, I'm talking about a principle, the principle of the rationality of the universe. So yeah, I'm arguing that the universe is a rational universe. Reality is rational. Okay, it's governed by the laws of logic and by the skills and functions of reason. But I also define what I call the logos principle, which comes, if we go back far enough, it comes from Greek philosophy, even from the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers. Heraclitus was one, who argued the very same thing, that the universe is rational. It has laws of logic, and it forces people to function with skills of reason. And then other philosophers caught on to that and embraced that and wrote about the logos, which is the Greek word for the rational order of the universe. Then in the Bible, the New Testament, we find that again.
Right. That usually the Christian associates the word logos, or however you pronounce it, usually with John 1. And the beginning was the word, and the word in the original Greek text was logos. And most of the, let's just say, outer fringe Christians would just say, well, the logos is the word is Jesus Christ, and that's it, without getting deep into the meaning of the word logos. You said in your book that the logos principle existed in the Old Testament. I think that was in page 21. By the way, the book, once again, is The Reason of Reason, and the reader can be very enriched in reading this book and getting it from Amazon.com. You said in page 21, you talked about the wisdom that is mentioned in the Old Testament. That was actually a surprise to me, because I thought the word logos is associated with the New Testament, specifically with the Gospel of John and probably the first letter of John. You talked about the wisdom that is mentioned in the wisdom literature part of the Old Testament: Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Songs of Solomon, and Ecclesiastes. And you said that it could, quote, be a precursor of the Greek idea of logos. Can I really find logos in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament?
Yeah, I think you can. I'm going to reach over here, get my phone, and look up my... I'm going to take a call. No, I'm just kidding. I'm going to look up Proverbs Chapter 8.
Okay.
Because that's where I get that from. The Bible has an Old Testament and a New Testament. And if we go to the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament, and if we go to chapter 8, we find this very interesting passage. It says, does not wisdom call? Does not understanding raise her voice? On the heights beside the way, at the crossroads she takes her stand. Beside the gates in front of the town, at the entrance of the portals, she cried aloud. To you, O men, I call, and my cry is to the children of man. Now, if I scroll down a little bit to verse 12, we get this passage in the first person, which is really interesting. It says, I, wisdom, dwell with prudence, and I find knowledge and discretion. The fear of the Lord is hatred of evil, pride and arrogance in the way of evil, and perverted speech I hate. I have counsel and sound wisdom. I have insight. I have strength. By me, kings reign and rulers decree what is just. By me, princes rule and nobles, all who govern justly. I love those who love me, and those who seek me diligently find me. And it goes on.
Okay, so would you say that this wisdom equals logic or logos?
Well, I think they're similar. I think that this bears a resemblance to my understanding of the way the Greek philosophers wrote about the logos. Because here in Proverbs chapter 8, there seems to be, most explicitly, it's sort of the principle of wisdom. So I don't think it's identical. But the writer here is writing about wisdom as something that has pre-existed everything. Okay? That wisdom governs the universe. And by wisdom, kings rule. And by wisdom, people find wealth and have good households. And by wisdom, the universe is ordered. And so I think, there is an overlap between the way wisdom is spoken of and the way the logos is spoken of by the Greek philosophers.
Well, interesting. In quoting the part of the Gospel of John that talks about the logos principle, you said that logos is both an impersonal principle, quote, and a personal one. What do you mean by personal? Personified, as in made into a human being, or personal as in it relates to one person in a subjective way?
Well, yeah. So John the Apostle, who wrote the gospel by his own name, the Gospel of John, he uses the logos in a very special and interesting way. And, we can sort of speculate about how and why. But he starts off the Gospel of John in this way. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. He was with God in the beginning. Now, most English translations of the Bible translate that this way. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. And it goes on to say, all things were made through him, and without him, nothing was made that has been made. Okay? And it keeps going. And we call that the prologue. So John, of all the four gospel writers, is the only one who uses the Logos this way. And as we continue further down in chapter 1, it becomes clear that he's referring to a person. The Logos is a person. And then as we keep reading down, it becomes obvious that that person is Jesus. Okay? It becomes indisputable that he is calling Jesus the Logos. He is equating them.
Yeah, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us.
That's right. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us.
I guess you touched into my next question already. When we live in the Detroit area, and this place is known to be very culturally diverse, very culturally rich. I live in Taylor, which is a suburb of the Detroit area, and many people would call it a predominantly Caucasian place. We have downtown Detroit that has a very rich African-American culture. There is a very rich Arabic culture in the Dearborn area. You talked about things that, quote, make sense as universal, and what makes sense to one person should make sense to everybody else. Do you think that is the case? Because my exposure to cultures, what makes sense in one community may not make sense in another community. Do you think there are things in common among all these radically different cultures?
Yes, absolutely. Now, without minimizing, the diversity of cultural characteristics, I like diverse cultural characteristics. I like different flavors, and I love different languages and all things that make people different from each other. Those are interesting. But yeah, all people have things in common. I call them self-evident things. There are also things that we can call universals. And in philosophy, some philosophers have celebrated universal things, and others have celebrated particular things, and the pendulum would swing in between those of each camp. Okay, but for example, the basic premise of this book is that all people reason. So no matter what your culture is, what country you're from, and what your age is, you reason. And that's good. It's good that you reason, and good that we all reason. And it's also so powerful of a function within us that we cannot not reason. Okay? You can reason poorly, or you can reason really well, and you can develop the skill of reasoning well. You should, okay? Because, there are forms of bad reasoning. But if you try to live your life without reasoning, you just couldn't. Mm-hmm. Okay? The fact of reason is something I call an existential constraint. Now, I don't use that word in this book.
As in, if you exist, then you have to reason.
Yes.
Okay.
If you exist, you have to reason. And reality forces you. Now, reality forces you to practice other things too. For example, to pursue your purpose in life. Everyone wants a purpose. And I talk about purpose in this book as well. I'm not sure if it's reason that tells us we should have a purpose, but there is a drive inside of you. There's an intuition. It's a yearning that tells you, I have a purpose. But what is it? I need to discover my purpose. And then you will live your whole entire life in pursuit of finding your purpose. Well, and I argue that's because you do have a purpose, that the universe is purposeful, the world is purposeful, people are purposeful, and that's because God is a God of purpose. He is purposeful, and the reason He has given you reason is so that you can accomplish goals, which are subsets of purpose.
Okay, let's talk about this God. That sounds to be the object of your whole argument in this book. Because you know that different belief systems define that God in different ways, and probably they have different gods altogether. And it's very tricky that some religions would claim that they worship the same God. Probably they define it in a way that is different, while other religions would say, no, this is not the God that we worship. You said in page 50 of your book, you may or may not agree with my proposition, which is a very recurring theme in your book. You have always reminded the reader that what you are presenting here is your own argument. You said, but metaphysical belief systems undeniably exist, so this has to be on the table, meaning the table of considering that there is a maximally intelligent being behind the logic and the reason of the universe. Am I understanding you correctly in saying, as long as there is a religion, then there is a God, regardless of what that religion is, knowing that if there is one thing all the followers of all the different religions agree upon is that these religions are not one and the same, and that most of them are man-made, if not all but one, or if not all of them?
Well, I'm not absolutely sure I understand your question.
Okay, so imagine a certain group of people in a certain remote part of the earth or history invented a religion. Would you look at their belief system, the metaphysical belief system, to conclude that there is a God, since they claim that there is a being, a supreme being?
How I put it in the book and how I'll say it now is it's very interesting that such a large majority of the world's population are religious,
Mm-hmm.
or they say they believe in God or a God or some gods, okay, or the divine force or something. Most people have a predisposition towards believing in divine things, religious things, spiritual beings, the spiritual invisible world, the metaphysical world. Now there are vast differences between each religion of the world, okay? But still, that so many people are religious in the world is evidence, not absolute proof, okay, but evidence that there are divine beings, that there are beings we can't see, okay, like angels and spirits. And most religions have room for them, even if you believe in an absolute one God, like Islam and like Christianity and like Judaism. Okay, there is still room for other invisible beings, like there's angels and there's jinn,
Mm-hmm.
and there's demons, and Satan is invisible too, and so on. So I don't think we can dismiss the invisible realm of God and other invisible beings when most of the world believes in these kinds of things.
Okay. Well,
does that make sense?
Absolutely. If it makes sense, quote unquote, that's absolutely right. If I may give the viewer here a spoiler alert, the conclusion or the theme of the book is mentioned in page 110. And once again, the name of the book is The Reason of Reason. It is available on Amazon.com. I really suggest that you at least take a look at that book. And if you happen to be fortunate enough to be in the Detroit area to talk with the author, my dear friend Scott Cherry, your theme is that the existence of reason, quote, and logic are strong evidence for God and the biblical God in specific. Okay, why the biblical God?
Sure. The biblical God, the Christian God, as it were, or the God who is portrayed in the New Testament is captured by the idea of the Logos principle. And remember the language of the Apostle John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Now, the word with is a preposition that entails complements, okay, togetherness, plurality. It says, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So there are two entities being spoken of in that verse. There's the Word, and there's God, and there's somehow a distinction between them. The New Testament portrays a God with multiple persons. This is controversial among monotheists. I understand because, in my book I have...
As in non-Trinitarians?
Yeah, non-Trinitarians and Unitarians and Muslims as an example.
Okay.
I try to capture 2 or 3 conversations in my book with Muslim students that I have met on the campus of the University of Michigan, and some non-Muslims too. But when I'm talking with Muslims, we always eventually come to, does God have multiple persons? Because that is the way the New Testament presents God. And that suggests that there's an enormously complex and robust multi-dimensionality about God, if I can put it that way. It means that God communes with himself and he enjoys himself. And this is what we can call reciprocity. Reciprocity, all right, it happens between people, and especially between friends and married people, parents and children. I give some of myself to you, and then I want you to give some of yourself to me, and I want us to share a back and forth exchange of our attributes and our thoughts and our desires and so on. So God is that way in the New Testament. Jesus pre-existed his birth, and he existed from all time with God the Father, the creator of the universe, and therefore there was always a mutual love between them. Okay? Because if there was no object of God's love, then there could be no love. There was always enjoyment between them. There was always communion between them. And that is what, again, I'm calling reciprocity. There was always reciprocity between them. And that's what makes the Christian understanding of God so rich and so full and so vibrant, if I may.
Now, am I understanding it correctly that the Christian presentation of the God that you argue in favor of in this book is based on strictly your the theme of the book, or the title of the book, the reason for reason? I mean, like, are you introducing this reciprocal God because the New Testament says so and that is your scripture? Or is that argument within the argument of reason and logic that you presented throughout the book?
Yeah, well, certainly it is captured and presented in the New Testament and in the Old Testament for that matter. So yes, but my argument until the very end is an argument that is focused on reason and rationality and logic and what I call complementarity. Complementarity is the idea that, it involves reciprocity, but that there is a subject and an object to all of reality. Okay, so the fact that we can reason is pointless unless there's something to reason about. For example, I'm the subject, I'm the one reasoning, but there needs to be something for me to reason about. So when I begin to analyze you, when I begin to think about you and consider your qualities, you become the object of my reasoning. Mm-hmm. Okay? Just like if I were loving you, you would be the object of my love, and so on. Language is complementary too. Okay? Language makes no sense unless there are two parties.
Speaker and the listener. Okay.
That's right. There's the giver and the receiver, the speaker and the listener. Right. And all books make no sense unless there is this complementarity going on. The fact that there is so much complementarity in the world, to me, is an illustration of the complementarity between the Father and the Son. They enjoy each other, love each other, commune with each other. They discuss their plans with each other. This is therefore imprinted onto reality. Why human beings are social beings. Why we're not, all individual atoms. Why we yearn for relationships with each other that have love and mutual enrichment. Why we pursue our purpose, as we talked about earlier, and why it's possible to find purpose. Why we pursue our happiness, and it's possible to find happiness. And in the book also, there's something we haven't mentioned yet. That's the idea of intelligibility. Okay, when we as humans are doing science, we are trying to discover things. We're trying to learn things about reality, about maybe physical objects or biological objects or about ecosystems. We have this built-in understanding that things are intelligible to us. If we apply reason to those things, we can gain knowledge and understanding about, for example, the nature of light, and the nature of the chemicals that make up air and so on, quantum physics, So intelligibility is another example of complementarianism or complementarity. And we live our lives accessing the knowledge and the information that is intelligible to us, to me, and I think it should hold weight to you. These are expressions of the nature of God.
What change do you hope to accomplish through this book? What do you hope to change the reader of that book in any way? What change would you like to see in the reader of your book?
Yeah. For other Christians, for theists, I want us to celebrate reason, quite honestly. I want Christian people, people who believe in God, and who believe in faith, to have a high esteem for reason, because reason is not actually the polar opposite of faith. Reason and faith overlap. They are also complements, and there is reciprocity between faith and reason. Okay? We depend on reason in the exercise of our faith. And there are examples of how we do that. There's examples of how we interpret divine revelation by reason. How we can separate something that is authentic revelation from something that's not authentic revelation. We do that partly by applying our reason. So we should celebrate reason. And really, implicitly, all higher institutions of learning, seminaries such as the one that I'm in now, Detroit Baptist Theological Seminary, they do celebrate reason by virtue of the fact that they exist and they're holding courses and that they're asking students to go through these rigors of intellectual advancement. That is a celebration of reason, but we should say so. We should talk about it. We should not disparage reason. Okay? And for non-theists, I hope that understanding and reflecting on reason, celebrating it and looking into it and examining reason should point you to God. It should point you to how God loves reason and he loves logic. And even he said, "Come, let us reason together, saith the Lord."
Amen.
And that goes on. He goes on a little bit. But that's fantastic and amazing to me that God invites and exhorts people to reason with him. That's his nature. God loves reason.
Very plausible and very noble motive to write a book. Once again, thank you so much for contributing to the Christian Library. This has been crossed off of my bucket list. I got to talk with the author of a book that I have recently read. If you get the opportunity to get the book and read it, it's The Reason of Reason, written by Scott Cherry. It is available on Amazon.com. Thank you so much for providing me with this honor of just exploring what was in your mind as you wrote the book. And thank you for writing the book.
You're welcome, and thank you very much for asking such insightful questions.